Chapter 211. In the basement of St. Selena Cathedral, in the guardroom outside Cheney's Gate. Leonard Mitchell was leaning on the back of his chair, his legs were propped up on the table. His eyes were vacant without any focus. Even though he had been healed using ritualistic magic, he still looked terrible, as if he had obtained reprieve from a severe illness without fully recovering. At the moment, the powerful Beyonders sent by the Holy Cathedral were creating another seal behind the Cheney's Gate since the ashes of St. Selena was lost. They had conflicting opinions, some wanting to fill in the gap of power using a new holy item, while the others believed that there was no need to go through all the trouble. After all, to the Church of the Evernight Goddess, holy items were rare and incredibly precious. What they suggested was lowering the presence of the Nighthawks in Tingen and transferring the artifacts with living characteristics or difficult-to-seal artifacts to the headquarters at the Cathedral of Serenity in Backlund's diocese, only leaving behind those that could be controlled more easily. They intended to send a telegram to propose a meeting of the higher-ups, to get a vote from the archbishops and high-ranking deacons. Leonard was uninterested in this debate. He felt as if he had become a living corpse, with no sorrow, grief, agitation, or excitement. He was abnormally numb. He didn't want to face anyone. All he wanted was to stay alone in the corner. Occasionally, he would feel puzzled about why the murderer would only take away Klein's Beyonder characteristic and leave Captain Dunn Smith's one intact. Thud. 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 Footsteps reverberated in the corridor. Sika Tron, whose right arm had been bandaged, appeared at the door of the guardroom. While Klein and the others were attacking Megos and attempting to save Tingen City, she and the keepers within Cheney's Gate were doing battle against a portion of the sealed artifacts. If it wasn't for the timely arrival of the members of the mandated Punishers and the machinery hive mind, or the eventual arrival of the reinforcements from the Holy Cathedral, she also might have lost her life. But even so, the elderly keeper failed to last until the end. He fought to his death, under the call of duty. Leonard, I found an unencrypted telegram in the captain's office. It was sent over by the Holy Cathedral, Sika Tron said. Leonard's green eyes moved slightly, finally coming to life. He faintly recalled the sound of a new telegram coming in, but the battle was about to begin. He and Klein didn't have the time to pay attention to it. What does it say? Leonard noticed that his tone was unusually raspy. The white-haired and black-eyed Sika Tron replied without hesitation, beware of Insanguil. Beware of sealed artifact 0-08. Insanguil, the archbishop that betrayed the church, the gatekeeper who failed his advancement. Sealed artifact 0-08, an ordinary-looking quill. Leonard muttered at first as he searched his memories, then he tilted his head to the side. He suddenly narrowed his eyes, the dispirited feelings and sadness disappeared from his body. So that's how it was. Leonard pulled his feet back and stood up, his green eyes burning with a passion. He looked at Sika Tron and said, I intend to apply to join the Red Gloves. The Red Gloves was a code name for the elite team of Nighthawks. Under normal circumstances, Nighthawk teams were situated locally and had regions under their jurisdiction. They were not permitted to capture criminals outside of their area of jurisdiction without permission. As such, some evildoers would change their location after every crime, making it terribly inconvenient for the Nighthawks. To deal with this, the Church of the Evernight Goddess set up the Red Gloves. They were carefully selected elites, some even possessing incomplete holy items. Their mission was to reinforce Nighthawk teams that had called for help, as well as track down and arrest evildoers without any restrictions. In some circles, they were also called pursuers, or hunting dogs. Red Gloves. But their lowest requirement is sequence 7. Besides, the dangers the Red Gloves face are many times higher than an ordinary Nighthawk squad, Sika Tron said in concern and doubt. Leonard smiled coldly. I'm close to advancing soon. His eyes became cold. He clenched his teeth and said to himself. I want revenge. In Sanguil, you must live until the day I become powerful enough. All right. Sika seemed to have guessed Leonard's thoughts. She sighed. Almost half of our team will be new faces. It's rare to see a Nighthawk team become so ravaged. Leonard's expression darkened. He clenched his teeth and asked, are the bodies ready? Yes. Sika nodded indiscernibly. Leonard suddenly stepped towards the door. I'll notify their families. I'll deal with the scene I don't want to deal with the most. I'll do it. At 2, Daffodil Street, Melissa sat on the sofa, inspecting the 3 tickets in her hands. She was looking at the words, the printed date, and the seat numbers. Benson was sitting beside her, observing his sister with a smile. He had a relaxed posture. Suddenly, they heard the doorbell. Ding dong, ding dong. Melissa glanced at their busy maid Bella, then she took the 3 tickets with her and stood up, looking a little confused. She briskly ran to the door. Her black hair was shinier than it was before, her face no longer skinny. The color of her skin had a ruddy color, and her brown eyes looked brighter and energetic. Twisting the handle and opening the door, Melissa froze for a moment. She didn't recognize their visitor. It was a young man with black hair and green eyes. He looked handsome, but his face was unusually pale. Hidden in his eyes was deep sorrow. May I know who you are? Melissa asked, feeling somewhat lost. Leonard had specially draped a black formal coat over his white shirt. He said in a raspy voice, I'm a colleague of your brother Klein. Melissa's heart suddenly skipped a beat. She instinctively tiptoed to look behind Leonard but didn't notice anything. She said with a strange quiver in her voice, where's Klein? Leonard closed his eyes, inhaling as he said, I'm very sorry, your brother Klein died at the hands of an evil criminal while he was trying to save others. He's a hero, a true hero. Melissa widened her eyes slowly, her body shaking indiscernibly. The 3 tickets in her hands dropped helplessly onto the floor. The tickets faced upward, revealing the name of the play, The Return of the Count. Sitting in the Moretti family's living room, Leonard didn't dare to look directly at Melissa and Benson. But he couldn't stop scenes of what they looked like from flashing through his mind. That girl filled with youthfulness and vibrancy had her eyes wide open. She didn't speak, and her eyes were unfocused. Her silence made her appear like a puppet. The man who looked a little like Klein maintained a normal posture, but he would slip into a daze from time to time. His words came out slowly. That's the gist of the matter. I'm very sorry that I was unable to prevent it in a timely manner. The Blackthorn Security Company, the police department, and those that he helped have promised a bereavement compensation of about £6,000. Leonard said, as his eyes darted around. Suddenly, Benson interrupted him. His voice was hoarse as he asked, where's his body? I'm asking where's Klein's body? He puckered his lips and paused. When can we see him? In the company. You can see him now, Leonard answered, unable to mask his grief. All right. Benson moved his rigid lips with great difficulty. Let me use the bathroom first. Without waiting for Leonard's reply, he quickly entered the bathroom and slammed the door closed. He stood in front of the sink and turned on the tap, allowing the water to flow. He bent down and repeatedly splashed water onto his face. As he did that, his actions came to a sudden stop. Nothing changed for a long time, leaving only the sound of running water reverberating in the bathroom. A few minutes later, Benson lifted his head and looked into the mirror. He saw that his face was covered in water droplets, the redness in his eyes was impossible to hide now. A few days later, in a corner of the Raphael Cemetery. After finishing Dunn's funeral, the crowd gathered before a new tombstone. On it was Klein's black and white photograph, a very scholarly photograph. Melissa stood before the grave, her eyes without focus. Beside her, Elizabeth kept wiping away her tears. Leonard, Benson, Fry, and Brett carried the coffin and walked over, lowering the coffin into the grave. After the priest gave the eulogy in individual prayers, the grave was filled with soil, covering the black coffin bit by bit. At this moment, Melissa knelt down and tossed in the copper whistle she found on her brother's body. Leonard turned and looked at the scene, his heart wincing. However, he admired how strong this girl was. He knew that this girl didn't cry after receiving the bad news. Instead, she stayed pitifully quiet. The grave was leveled and a stone slab was laid over it. Leonard took a final look at Klein's tombstone. There were 3 lines to his epitaph: the best elder brother, the best younger brother, the best colleague. Under the mournful atmosphere, the members of the Blackthorn Security Company gradually left. Selina and Elizabeth also bade farewell under the urging of their families. The only people left behind were Benson and Melissa. "I'll get a rental carriage." Benson was in a terrible condition, it was as if he hadn't slept for a long time. "All right." Melissa nodded. After seeing her brother leave, she turned to look at the tombstone. She squatted down and buried her face in her arms. After some silence, Melissa suddenly scolded, "Stupid." She cried as she wept silently. Her tears just wouldn't stop. Night time, at the Raphael Cemetery. The copper-skinned Azek stood in front of Klein's grave holding a bouquet of white flowers. He didn't speak for the longest time until he finally sighed and muttered to himself, "I'm sorry, I was 10 minutes late. But I think I know who it was." He bent over and set the bouquet of flowers down before turning to leave the cemetery. He also left Tingen, but he didn't retrieve the copper whistle. The place was quiet and serene under the illumination of the crimson moonlight. Suddenly, the stone slab sealing the grave was flipped open. A pale hand extended out from the soil. A hand came out. Whoosh! The gravestone was shoved aside. The lid of the coffin was pushed open. Klein sat upright and looked around, lost. His memory was still frozen at the scene with the brand new leather boots, and the palm that grabbed onto the urn of Saint Selena's ashes. Everything after that felt like a dreamless sleep. Klein instinctively lowered his head and unbuttoned his shirt. He looked at the left side of his chest, only to see that his ravaged injury and missing heart were squirming as they healed, similar to how he recovered from the bullet wound through his temple back when he looked into the mirror. The only difference was that this time, the recovery was much slower and much more difficult. Chapter 212. In the northern part of the Lone Kingdom, the September breeze, that had an additional coldness to it, howled through the cemetery. It was even gloomier and colder than usual. The cold jolted Klein back to his senses as he muttered with a rueful smile, "It looks like there are still some secrets behind my transmigration, but it seems like I'll only be able to resurrect another 2 times at most, not any more. And if I were to minced up or completely crushed, who knows if this recovery ability that doesn't usually appear would even be useful." After half a minute, Klein buttoned his suit and realized that he was wearing his newest shirt and tuxedo, but they were now covered in soil and dirt. Benson and Melissa really have no idea how to save money. The thought popped into his head. He supported his weight on his hand and flipped up into a standing position, realizing that he still had his clown abilities. The best elder brother. The best younger brother. The best colleague. Klein looked at his tombstone and read the inscription. He felt his heart wince, seemingly sensing the despondent feelings Melissa and Benson had experienced. "This is probably even more depressing than watching Captain die before my eyes." He sighed and retracted his gaze. He squatted down and closed the coffin lid. His thoughts were still scattered, but Klein knew that he had to take care of the scene as soon as possible and not let anyone notice. Resurrection wasn't something any commoner could accept. If the Nighthawks, mandated punishers, or the machinery hive mind learned of this, Klein believed that he wouldn't have a great ending. Of course, if it was on Earth, he could deceive the people into believing that he was the blessed one of God, the man of salvation, had he consumed the lawyer or swindler potions. However, in the world he was in, there was a real God that could respond to rituals. He scraped the soil back together and covered it with the stone slab. Klein clapped his hands and stood up once again. At that moment, the scene didn't appear strange. He was just like a gentleman who came to offer his condolences late at night. The only oddity was that the person in the photo on the tombstone looked exactly like him. During the process of filling his grave, his spirituality noticed the existence of Isaac's copper whistle. Hence, he dug it out and wiped it clean. However, Klein didn't intend to summon the messenger immediately. He decided to figure out the situation first. Klein lifted his left hand and saw the topaz pendant that was still wrapped around his wrist. I guess this is considered a burial object. He gave a self-deprecating laugh and took off the pendulum. He looked around, and his face grew solemn. Captain should be buried in this cemetery as well, I guess. He changed directions twice and finally determined the location of Dunn's tombstone using the pendulum. With the moonlight's aid, Klein walked around and searched for about 15 minutes until he finally saw Captain's monochrome photo. It had a gentle expression, high hairline, gray eyes, nothing unusual compared to before. Under Dunn's photo was his name, date of birth, date of death, and epitaph. The true guardian, the most trusted partner, the captain forever. Klein looked in stunned silence and somehow his sight grew blurry for some baffling reason. He felt as though he had returned to that day again. He saw the captain turn his head to him and wink. He spoke with a mellow and relaxed voice. "We saved Tingen." "Captain!" Klein shouted in silence. He stood there like a statue for a good few minutes until he suddenly said with a smile, "Captain, your mental state was definitely not the best that day. You even said things like you could bring old Neil into the dreamland if he hadn't lost control. He was a mystery prior, and you're a nightmare. You couldn't consume the beyonder characteristic that he left behind." "Yes. You didn't ask me what powerful offensive attacks I had. Was it trust, or did you forget about it? But, you definitely guessed something. I only took one sealed artifact and said it was for Leonard. Even without a brain, you could have guessed that I had the extra means for a powerful attack." Having said that, Klein paused, then he shook his head and sighed. "I have no idea what I am now. Maybe I'm just an evil spirit that has clawed its way back from hell to seek revenge." As he spoke, he suddenly stopped. His tears streamed down his cheeks and finally, he shouted softly with a choking voice, "Captain! We miss you too." Klein felt the cold breeze blow past him as he lifted his hands to wipe his tears and blow his nose. He became silent again and found a hidden spot nearby. He took 4 steps counterclockwise and entered the world above the gray fog. He wanted to find the person that killed him with the aid of divination. He wanted to know the murderer who triggered all of this. As he's already appeared before me, I'm sure that I can divine some information. Klein pursed his lips tightly together and saw the lofty palace and ancient model table as usual. He took the seat that belonged to the fool. A yellowish-brown goatskin and fountain pen appeared before him. Since his physical body in reality was under limited protection, Klein didn't delay and wrote down his divination statement after a moment's thought. "The person who killed me." He recited it 7 times and leaned back into the chair. He entered his dream with the aid of cogitation. In the blurry world, there were countless points of light dancing and gathering. In the end, they formed a scene. A pair of brand new leather boots, a pair of slightly pale hands, and the Saint Selena's urn that was held by those hands. He looked up, and Klein saw a middle-aged man with short, dark blonde hair. He wore a black 2-button suit, and one of his eyes was obviously blind while the other one was so blue that it was almost black. His facial features were like carvings, and his face had no wrinkles at all. The image shattered and Klein woke up from his dream. His eyebrows were tightly knitted. He found his murderer very familiar. As a seer, he quickly understood why he found the person familiar. It was because he had seen the man's photo on a wanted notice. The murderer was Ince Sanguil. He was the former archbishop of the Church of the Evernight Goddess who took sealed artifact 0-08. He had failed to advance as a gatekeeper. It's him. Countless images flashed through Klein's head, and they finally stopped on the scene when Insanguil picked up Saint Selena's urn. Tap. 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 Klein extended his hands and rapped the edge of the long bronze table. He felt that he suddenly understood many things. The captain said that a beyonder that dies normally would leave behind a beyonder characteristic. When gathered together, they're equivalent to a potion that lacks the supplementary ingredients. In other words, as long as one knows the corresponding supplementary ingredients, they can advance using remains. Of course, one cannot consume beyond their level, as it would easily lead to a loss of control or going insane. Becoming a high-sequence beyonder would require the accompaniment of some special ritual. That was mentioned in the incomplete unshadowed formula. The subsequent advancements would require a ritual as well. Insanguil is a gatekeeper, a sequence 5 from the death sequence pathway. He wanted to become a high-sequence beyonder, a demigod. Based on the situation allowed by the exchanging of sequences, he had 3 choices. One was obviously sequence 4 in the death sequence pathway, second was sequence 4 in the sleepless sequence pathway, and third was sequence 4 in the God of Combat sequence pathway, Demon Hunter. Saint Selena was a saint. She was either sequence 4 or sequence 3. Her urn corresponds to one of the 2 sequence potions. Insanguil, who was a former archbishop, definitely knew exactly which one she was, and he definitely knew the required supplementary ingredients. Was his true motive in planning all of this to get Saint Selena's ashes and advance to sequence 4 in the sleepless pathway? The skull of Death's descendant, that might be an ingredient needed for the special ritual. It was from the death sequence pathway, after all. From the looks of it, his target was the captain, and not me. He really was the mastermind behind all this. Having figured this out, Klein wrote down a corresponding divination statement. He took his pendulum and let the topaz hang above the surface of the paper. After he recited the statement, he opened his eyes and saw the topaz pendant spinning clockwise. It meant that the information he provided was sufficient, and the divination was successful. It meant that Insanguil had really plotted the series of events in order to get Saint Selena's ashes, to advance to sequence 4. Klein rapped on the edge of the table again as he mulled over a different question. Insanguil was merely a sequence 5 gatekeeper. Relying on him alone, would make it impossible for him to create so many coincidences. For instance, for Megos to follow his arrangements and visit the Nighthawks at the correct time. So, is it the power of sealed artifact 0-08? Its appearance is that of an ordinary quill. Its function is to write down events that are bound to happen. No, it couldn't be that easy. Otherwise, Insanguil could write that Saint Selena's urn grew a pair of wings and flew into his hands. Then, he could have just waited at home. There must be certain restrictions. 0-08 most likely doesn't possess direct combat ability. Otherwise, Insanguil could have stormed through Cheney's Gate in Tingen. As one of the most dangerous sealed artifacts, perhaps it can let people act according to its description without realizing it. That was the reason behind all the coincidences. If that's really true, then 0-08 is quite terrifying. Even Megos, who was pregnant with the son of an evil god, adhered to its arrangements. No wonder grade 0 sealed artifacts are extremely dangerous. They're of the highest importance and of the highest confidentiality. They're not to be inquired, disseminated, described, or spied. Klein stopped rapping the edge of the table. He divined his earlier guess, but, unfortunately, it failed due to a lack of information. He saw that a few minutes had passed, and he planned to return to the real world as soon as possible. Hence, he didn't let his thoughts run wild but wrote down the penultimate divination statement. The city where Insanguil currently is. Due to the existence of sealed artifact 0-08 and the fact that Insanguil had likely become a demigod, Klein couldn't divine his exact location directly. He could only make a rough inquiry of the general area. Of course, if there wasn't a mysterious space like the world above the grey fog to eliminate disturbances, he would definitely fail in divination, even if it was a rough inquiry. He leaned against the high-back chair and recited the divination statement 7 times. He dreamed again and entered the blurry world. The blurry world suddenly cracked, and there was a wide river which was slightly murky. There was a grand bridge above the river. Both banks had ports lined one after another. There were many goods and many workers. To the northeast of the river, there were rows upon rows of houses. Most of them had the Lone Kingdom's present-day architectural styles, such as polygenic roofs, oriel windows, and no veranda by the street. Other than that, there was a lot of Gothic architecture. The streets were filled with people and carriages. From time to time, strange machinery could be seen. The farther east he went, the more chimneys there were and the smokier it got. When he headed west, the elevation rose, and there were houses in grayish-blue, beige, and light yellow that spiraled up opulent castles and Gothic clock towers. Gong! The chime of a clock sounded and snapped Klein back to his senses. He knew which city he had seen. The Land of Hope, and the City of Cities, Backlund. Chapter 213. So in Sangwil has gone to Backlund. I wonder how long he'll stay there. Yes. I should confirm this every now and then. Klein leaned forward as he thought. He erased the contents on the goatskin and wrote a new divination statement, Lenivis's current location. From his point of view, the person that caused the captain and him to nearly die was undoubtedly in Sangwil, but the lunatic Lenivis was definitely an accomplice who cannot shirk from the responsibility. He had to pay the price in blood. After reciting the statement 7 times, Klein once again entered the dream. But the scene that appeared after the foggy world shattered was the same as the one he had seen before. A wide, slightly murky river, countless piers and buildings. The buildings were primarily in the present lone architectural style, some a little more Gothic. There were crowded streets, flourishing sites, chimneys that continually spewed smoke. There were opulent castles standing tall with the trademark Gothic clock towers. Lenivis was also in the Land of Hope, the City of Cities, Backlund. Klein opened his eyes, a little confused. He had divined for Lenivis's specific location, but the results were still a very general, vague region. This tells me that Lenivis's sequence must be much higher than I imagined. No, it could also be that he's received a large benefit from helping the Son of the true Creator descend upon this world. For example, a little godhood characteristics, or some object similar to the placenta left behind by Magos's baby? The latter would most likely have been taken away by Insangwil. Thoughts ran through Klein's mind as he muttered to himself whilst he made initial assumptions. After confirming the rough area where both his enemies were, he thought about another problem. He still didn't have the ability to exact revenge. Even if Lenivis is only a sequence 7, or even 8, it wouldn't be easy to deal with him if he did indeed receive a large benefit. Lenivis is also obviously very crafty, he could outwit and defeat Beyonders more powerful than himself. Insangwil is even more terrifying. He's a sequence 4 demigod, and he wields a powerful grade 0 sealed artifact. Although there were some secrets surrounding my transmigration, it's clear that I can't convert those secrets into combat strength. It's likely that it's not possible for a very long period of time. The only means that I have are to continue raising my sequence, or I could collect even more powerful mystical items. I have to use both the methods at the same time. In between his thoughts, Klein decided to add another divination. He deliberated on the statement before writing solemnly, "My opportunities of becoming powerful." He gently placed the pen on the table and leaned back, then he closed his eyes. He recited the statement silently and fell into a deep sleep with the help of cogitation. In the foggy world, he once again saw the scene that he had previously seen. The river, piers, chimneys, crowds, castles, various machinery, and Gothic clock towers. He had once again seen the capital of the Lone Kingdom, Backlund. Immediately following that, the scene changed. He saw a magnificent peak piercing through the clouds, and, on it, he saw a majestic, ancient palace. He saw the giant throne carved from stone, adorned with dull gems and gold. He saw a strange vertical pupil formed from countless mysterious symbols. The scene shattered silently without warning. Klein slowly sat up and tapped on the edge of the table with his fingers. Backlund contains the opportunities for me to become powerful. Does the second scene refer to the main peak of the Hornacis mountain range, the treasures left behind by the Antigonus family? The strange vertical pupil formed by countless mysterious symbols which the misfortune cloth puppet conveyed to me through the corruption from the Antigonus family's notebook is the key to beginning all of this. Many thoughts flashed through his mind. Klein decided that he was in no rush to visit the Hornacis mountain range. Even a Sequence 4 demigod might not be able to deal with the dangers that resided there. I guess I'll head to Backlund first. Klein sighed and made a decision. He enveloped himself with spirituality and stimulated a descent, exiting the mysterious space above the gray fog. When he returned to the material world, he slowly walked out of his hiding spot towards Dunn Smith's grave. He stared deeply at the picture and epitaph. Klein slowly drew a crimson moon on his chest and walked out of the cemetery. As a former Nighthawk, a Nighthawk who had to regularly patrol Raphael's cemetery, he was quite familiar with the routes of the guards, as well as its surroundings. He managed to leave the cemetery easily, without causing any alarm. He followed the gravel road into Tingen, using the shade of the trees as cover. The night was peaceful and the moon was ever so dreamy. Klein walked alone, his thoughts running wild and unbridled. He sometimes considered his plan for revenge, sometimes thinking back to the times he spent with the captain, sometimes recalling old Neil's hidden grief beneath his humorous facade. Unknowingly, Klein had entered the nearest street like a wandering ghost, making his way past turn after turn. It was 2 hours later when he freed himself from that state and regained complete control of his thoughts. He realized that he was standing on Daffodil Street. Opposite him was the house he shared with his brother and sister. Instinctively, Klein had returned here. He took a step forward with clear joy, but suddenly paused. He let out a bitter smile and muttered with a self-deprecating tone, "If I went up and knocked on the door, Melissa might faint from shock. Benson would be so nervous his hair would start to drop. He would then try his best to calmly convince me, in the name of a curly-haired baboon." Shaking his head, Klein stared at the familiar door for a while before heading towards Iron Cross Street. "This is fine too, this is fine too. The things that I do in the future will not implicate them. The compensation given to them by the Nighthawks team and the police department will be enough for them to live a stable middle-class life, even if Melissa fails to find a job and Benson loses his job." Klein walked silently for a moment before starting to feel fatigue. But, as someone who was dead, he didn't have any other belongings on him except for the clothes he was wearing, his topaz pendulum, and Azek's copper whistle. He didn't have pounds, nor soli, nor pennies. Should I give the whistle a blow to send a letter to Mr. Azek and get him to help me? Klein laughed optimistically. Forget it, I shouldn't contact him for the time being. Perhaps since Zangwill is still keeping him under surveillance. I'll look for him when the time is right. To an old monster who has lived countless lives for thousands of years, he should be able to understand resurrection. At least it's not too cold tonight. I'll make do by finding a place to sleep for the time being and head to the Tingen branch of the Backlund Bank tomorrow morning to retrieve the money in the anonymous account. As there had been too many things to do lately. Klein hadn't had the time to start on the experiments involving the sacrificial ritual. He hadn't touched the £300 in the anonymous account either. That should be enough to support my expenses for quite a while. I'll buy a newspaper tomorrow to confirm what day it is. Miss Justice and the others didn't make any new prayers, which means that I didn't miss a gathering. Klein thought as he found a spot that had no wind. He sat down and took off his jacket. He used it as a blanket and leaned on the wall to sleep. It wasn't long into his sleep when he was suddenly woken by someone. He saw a policeman wielding a baton. He only had a single chevron on his epaulette, the lowest-ranking police constable. Klein glanced at him to ascertain his identity. The policeman said fiercely, "You can't sleep here. The streets and parks aren't for you lazy, jobless vagrants to sleep in. Those are the terms in the poor law." "Is that so?" Klein froze. Given his sensitive identity, he didn't argue with the policeman. He grabbed his jacket and continued walking until daybreak. Soon after, he lowered his head and entered the Tianjin branch of the Backland Bank. He took out £200 with the password he had set, leaving behind a third of the money as savings, in case of any emergencies. Without a doubt, Klein heard prayers when he wrote the password in ancient Hermes. Klein then spent £38 on 2 sets of formal wear, 2 shirts, 2 trousers, 2 pairs of leather boots, 2 bow ties, 4 pairs of socks, as well as 2 thick double-breasted jackets, 2 solid-colored fur coats, and 2 pairs of thick trousers in preparation for the winter. He also bought a cane, a wallet, and a leather luggage bag. After completing his purchase, Klein found a hotel to wash up and change in. He rented a private carriage directly to the train station in Tianjin in order to avoid meeting anyone familiar. Along the way, he purchased a newspaper and discovered that it was Sunday. It took about 4 hours to get from Tianjin to Backland by train. A luxurious first-class seat cost about £0.75, or 15 soldi. A second-class seat cost 10 soldi, or £0.50. The packed, poorly maintained third-class seats were rather cheap at only 5 soldi. Klein thought for a moment before buying a seat for the 2 o'clock train, a second-class seat. Klein found a random spot to sit in the waiting area with his ticket and luggage in hand. It was only slightly after 9 in the morning. He was happy that the Lone Kingdom didn't have a strict census. He could prove his identity just by using the water and gas bills, as well as his rent for the past 3 months. Purchasing a train ticket was even easier, as all he needed was money. Klein suddenly had an empty feeling in his heart as he was sitting there, thinking about how he was about to leave for Backland from Tianjin in the afternoon. He thought about his sister who always gave him a motherly vibe. He thought about his brother who liked to crack cold jokes. He thought about how they would fill their stomachs up so much that they wouldn't feel like moving. Recalling these scenes, Klein suddenly laughed. He laughed bitterly, for he thought about the tortoise that Melissa called a puppet, as well as Benson's pitiful hairline. He suddenly had a strong urge. He wanted to see his siblings again. At this moment, Klein suddenly realized why he hadn't picked an earlier train but instead bought a ticket for the 2 o'clock train. He carried his luggage and left the waiting area quickly, taking a rented carriage back to Daffodil Street. He then hid in a shady area on the opposite side and looked at the door to his house. There were many times when he felt like heading over, but he couldn't bring himself to cross the wide street. Klein looked across the road in a daze, suddenly having a feeling of homelessness. He'd had a similar feeling when he had just transmigrated. Suddenly, he saw the door to the house open as Melissa and Benson came out. Melissa was wearing a black dress and black veiled hat. Benson was in a shirt, vest, trousers, coat, and hat, all in black. They both had numb, sullen expressions. Melissa has become skinnier. Why is Benson so haggard? Klein's heart winced in pain. He opened his mouth but couldn't shout out their names. Without realizing it, he followed Benson and Melissa to the nearest municipal square. He saw that tents had been erected there again. A new circus troupe was in town for a performance. Benson took out some money and purchased the entrance tickets and led Melissa into the circus. He forced a smile. This circus troupe is very famous. Melissa nodded without expression. Okay. Suddenly, she slipped and almost fell. Klein, who was also buying a ticket, opened his mouth. He wanted to help his sister, but he could only retract the hand he had instinctively extended and stood helplessly in the busy crowd. Benson jumped in fright, but he was too late to help. However, Melissa quickly steadied herself. She puckered her lips and said nothing. At this moment, clowns swarmed forward, some performing balancing acts on wheels or large rubber balls, others tossing countless tennis balls into the air, then ridiculously catching every one of them. Melissa seemed to disregard the clowns as she looked at the performance. Benson tried to lift his sister's spirits by cheering, but he didn't succeed. He slowly turned sullen too. Klein puckered his lips tightly as he watched this scene from afar. He wanted to approach them, but he didn't dare to. Suddenly, he touched the wallet in his jacket and had an idea. Benson and Melissa continued walking forward, silently watching the various performances. Some time later, they saw a clown running towards them. His face was painted in colorful pastels. At first, he threw a tennis ball into the air, and, while the attention of the surrounding people was drawn to the air, he conjured a flower out of thin air. It was a Seville chrysanthemum. The clown brought the flower before Melissa and Benson. The flower was golden in color and symbolized happiness. Melissa and Benson looked at the clown in a daze. All they saw was a wide smile plastered over the pastel face. It was a happy smile, an exaggerated smile, a ridiculous smile. End of the first volume. Chapter 2:14 Choo Choo. A train whistle resounded in every corner of the station as a metal behemoth, in the form of a steam locomotive, came to a slow stop with more than 20 carriages in tow. Dressed in a tuxedo and half-top hat, Klein was carrying an exaggerated luggage bag that appeared incongruent with his figure. He took a firm step onto the ground of the Lone Kingdom's capital, Backlund. This city was divided into two regions by the Tussock River which flowed to the southeast. The two lands were connected by the Backlund Bridge and ferries, with a population exceeding 5 million people. It was the most prosperous capital in the southern and northern continents. Klein looked far into the distance and saw faint yellow hazes everywhere. Visibility was terrible, and the gas lamps hanging above the train platform were already lit to dispel the gloominess and darkness. It's only 6:30. It looks like it's 9 or 10. Klein shook his head indiscernibly. Suddenly, he recalled a joke he read on the Tussock Times. A gentleman who just arrived in Backlund finds himself lost in the thick haze. Helpless, he asks a drenched gentleman passing him by, "How do you get to the Tussock River?" The gentleman answers him in a friendly manner, "Walk straight without stopping. I just swam from there." Every time I read Backlund newspapers or magazines, the reporters and editors will make a mockery of the polluted air or the increasing number of foggy days in every conceivable way possible. Previously, the Backlund Daily Tribune even did the statistics, and it was found that it has gone from about 60 days a year from 30 years ago to the present 75 days a year. For this, many far-sighted people established organizations like the Soot Reduction Association, Smoke Reduction Association. Apparently, there was a bill in September that motioned the need to establish the National Atmospheric Pollution Council. Klein lowered his huge luggage bag and pinched his nose to gain respite from the sudden discomfort. Then, tracing his golden chain, he fished out a golden pocket watch from his vest pocket. He popped it open and looked at the time. When he truly bade farewell to his siblings, he had especially visited a department store and spent £4.10 solely to buy a golden pocket watch and matched it with a golden chain worth £1.05 solely. To not constantly be aware of the exact time made him feel a sense of horror. Klein had planned on buying a silver pocket watch as he felt it matched his temperament. But after considering the true essence of a clown, he finally chose a more showy and exaggerated golden watch. 6:39. It's not that much later. Klein put away his pocket watch and held his cane and luggage bag as he slowly walked out the steam locomotive station with the crowd. Suddenly, he made a sudden turn, causing a person who was secretly tailing him to have his hand fall empty when reaching for his pocket. Klein was unfazed by this episode as he followed the cement-paved road and mixed into the crowd, arriving at an intersection in front of him. There was a lawn and garden that circled around a column that resembled a chimney. No, it's very likely a chimney. Klein saw the column spewing thick smoke from its top end. A portion of the smoke floated high into the sky as a portion condensed into tiny liquid droplets that scattered everywhere. Klein paused once again and placed his luggage down. He spread open the newspaper and map that he had held onto using his other hand. While on the steam locomotive, he had already planned where he was going to go or what to do next. The experiences that he had undergone, and the mental experience that he had, when disguised as a clown in the morning, made Klein finally understand the true essence of a clown. Although being capable of knowing a little about fate, one remains helpless towards fate, therefore, one might as well use a smiling face to hide all the pain, sorrow, confusion, and depression. At that moment, he clearly felt the clown potion digest and believed that if he continued acting this way, it wouldn't take long for him to make another attempt at advancing. But herein lay the problem: he didn't know the corresponding name of the sequence 7 potion, much less know its exact formula. How should I obtain the formula? The secret order seldom appears. They only seem to be interested in the Antigonus family's items. This is also why others have little understanding of them. Yes. I should consider 2 aspects. 1. I need to come into contact with the local Beyonder circles and see if I can find clues. 2. I should set a trap and use the Antigonus family's treasure as bait to lure the secret order out. After all, I do possess knowledge of the strange vertical pupil formed from the numerous mysterious symbols. But that's too risky. I need to be careful since the bait cannot be too good or too bad. It won't garner their interest if it's too bad, and if it's too good, I might end up attracting a shark that can swallow me whole. The secret order's leader, Zeradol, is a figure who guided Emperor Roselle. Maybe he had obtained the biggest slice of the pie during that revolutionary feast. Of course, he might not still be alive, as that was something from 200 years ago. Amidst his thoughts, Klein felt the coldness of Backlund and couldn't help but shiver. He decided to find a residence as soon as possible. He flipped through the papers and, once again, browsed through the rental section and saw a circled advertisement. 15, Minsk Street, Sherwood Borough, Terrace House. Weekly rent of 18 solely. Klein had thought this through very carefully about the area in which he was to stay in. Although Backlund had a population exceeding 5 million people, he still needed to be wary about meeting the local nighthawks. Be it the newly transferred Daly or Lorata, Iyer Harson, and Borja that he previously met, they would definitely be able to recognize him. Therefore, Klein eliminated the North Borough, where the Church of the Evernight Goddesses Backlund Diocese's headquarters and St. Samuel Cathedral, was. He also eliminated areas with the best security and the extremely strictly monitored Empress Borough and Western Borough. These 2 boroughs belonged to the nobles and the richest magnates, with more of the nobles living closer to Empress Borough. After eliminating the worker areas, the harbor, and the East Borough and Backlund Bridge region where the poor gathered, Klein had few choices left. The first choice was Hillston Backlund, where the Backlund Stock Exchange, Clearing House, Futures Center, the 7 major banks' headquarters, various trust funds, rail companies, and bulk cargo commerce companies were. It was known as the financial, business, and economic center of the Lone Kingdom. The second choice was Sherwood Borough, where there were many small companies and residential buildings. The 2 boroughs had a lot of people in them, and the security was relatively good. It was good for hiding in. After serious consideration, Klein chose the cheaper Sherwood Borough. The reason why he didn't seek out organizations like the Capital Housing Improvement Company or Capital Housing Improvement Association was due to the fact that they needed identification, which he couldn't produce at the moment. If I can't find a place to rent today, I'll find a motel that doesn't need any identification to stay for the night. Klein gathered the things in his hand and carried his luggage. According to the map, he walked towards what seemed like a department store's entrance. That was the Backlund Metro's entrance. Yes, a metro. The first time Klein saw the word metro on the newspapers and magazines, he nearly jumped in fright. He never expected that such a transportation vehicle had become a reality in this era which hadn't entered the age of electricity. It was born 25 years ago. It first connected both banks of the Tussock River and had now expanded to the key city boroughs. Of course, there weren't many stations. Through the main door, Klein followed the people ahead of him as he walked to the ticketing booth. After being in line for a few minutes, he finally saw a cashier with a head with beautiful golden hair. The lady didn't raise her head. All she did was point at the wooden board by the side of the window with the prices. Peak period, 7 a.m. to 9 a.m., 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. 10-minute headway. 15-minute headway for all other times. First class seat, 6 pence second class seat, 4 pence third class seat, 3 pence. Return trips are respectively, 9, 6, 5 pence. Annual pass first class, £8 second class, £5 10 solely third class, no annual pass. It's cheaper than I imagined. There's actually no distance restriction. Melissa would definitely love this more than a horse carriage. This is the culmination of machinery. Klein thought as he suddenly felt upset. He revealed a brilliant smile and fished out 4 pence and handed it to the cashier. Second class seat. Smack. The cashier tore a ticket and stamped it before handing it to Klein. After finding the line that led to Sherwood Borough and passing through the not very strict security checks, Klein went down the flight of stairs and quickly came to the platform. He followed the labels on the ground and found the corresponding location for second-class seats. Choo-choo. He didn't wait long before he heard the chugging sound of the train and the thunderous steam whistle. He saw a huge steam locomotive, its large and meandering body, together with its black metallic luster and complex machinery, mixed together to form a unique beauty. Backlund's metro still used steam locomotives. The smoke that they spewed was specially designed to enter a pipe above and travel through a chimney, out into the world. This was also the true usage for the lawn and garden out on the streets. Amidst the screeching sound of metal, Klein first waited for the passengers to alight before carrying his cane and luggage over slowly. He then allowed the conductor to check his tickets. Unlike the third-class seats, the second-class seats were one person to a seat, so there were no concerns about having one seat snatched. Just as Klein sat down, stowed away his luggage, and leaned on his cane, he suddenly heard hurried footsteps. He subconsciously looked towards the door and saw a thin, adolescent boy rush into the carriage. The boy was wearing a coat that didn't suit his age. He wore a rounded top hat and carried a ragged haversack. He kept his head very low. "I'm sorry. I got on the wrong carriage. I'm from third class." He showed his ticket and apologized to the passengers before briskly walking towards the third-class carriage. Klein retracted his gaze and once again confirmed his destination as he waited for the doors to the carriage to close. At that moment, he heard chaotic and hurried footsteps. He then saw a few men dressed in black coats and half-top hats rush into the carriage. Are they chasing after that 15-year-old boy? Klein instinctively had such a thought. He shook his head gently and continued reading his newspapers and map, just like the other passengers on board the carriage. Joke adapted from English magazine, Punch. Chapter 215. Did you see a teenage boy? He's wearing an old coat. One of the men who dashed into the carriage asked the conductor fiercely. Klein glanced at the man through the corner of his eyes. He was thin and hardy, his skin a dark shade from prolonged exposure to the sun. His eyes were much more recessed than the typical Lone Kingdom citizen. A Highlander? Or a mixed blood? He nodded thoughtfully. In the middle of the northern continent, the point where the Hornacis mountain range began, there was a highland which was extremely hot and dry. Most of it belonged under the Fanapotter kingdom, while the area west belonged to the Intis Republic. The area to the east belonged to the Lone Kingdom. Its natives were thin and barbarians, but they were brave and skillful in warfare. A long time ago, they posed as one of the biggest problems for the three nations. But with the advancement of gunpowder, and the changes in the way war was carried out, these Highlanders eventually recognized reality and submitted. A large number of them left the highlands and entered Backland, Trier, Fanepotter City, and the various flourishing cities or ports in the northern continent. Some were workers, while others became grunts of the local triads. They dared to kill and showed no fear of thorny situations. The conductor was a man in his 20s. He shrank back when he heard that as he pointed in the direction of the third-class carriage. I saw him. He went that way. The leader, wearing a black coat and half-top hat, nodded indiscernibly. He led his men and rushed to the third-class carriage and showed no concern towards the surrounding passengers. If I were that boy, I would have already alighted from the third-class carriage. As Klein read his newspaper, he began letting his thoughts stray. About a minute later, the train whistled as the carriage doors closed. Chug! Chug! The steam metro began speeding up as it cruised along. But at that moment, Klein suddenly sensed something as he looked up to see the door leading to the other second-class carriages. The teenage boy walked slowly into the carriage wearing his old coat and round top hat while carrying a ragged haversack. He looked adolescent and had refined facial features. His red eyes were staid and solemn. Impressive. He alighted from the third-class carriage and circled around to enter from the first-class carriage again. Was he afraid that his pursuers had partners waiting inside the metro station? Klein was slightly surprised. He felt that the boy's handling of the situation was rather mature and careful. He was much better than most people in their 20s. He clicked this left molar lightly and secretly activated his spirit vision. He scanned the boy and saw that he was in a state of fatigue. His emotions were tense and he was dispirited. However, he still maintained a blueness that represented calm thinking. Impressive, at his age. Klein mumbled silently as he lowered his head and continued reading his papers. The boy didn't notice that he had been scrutinized by a beyonder as he headed for the third-class carriage once again. The rest of the journey happened stably and calmly. Klein arrived 20 minutes later at one of the 3 train stations in Sherwood Borough. He took a rented carriage for nearly 10 minutes before finding Minsk Street. According to the descriptions in the papers, he came to Unit 17, which was next to Unit 15, and pulled the doorbell. Cuckoo! Cuckoo! As sounds reverberated inside the house, a mechanical bird that didn't look too fancy popped out from above the door. It was about the size of a palm and was made up of gears and other parts. It constantly nodded its head and let out the sound of a cuckoo bird. Not a bad toy. It's just not very well crafted. Klein made an objective assessment. Nearly 20 seconds later, the dark door was pulled open. A young maidservant dressed in white and black looked warily at Klein and asked, "May I help you?" Klein smiled and waved his cane, which was now wrapped with the newspapers. "I'm here to find Mrs. Sammer about renting a house. I'm guessing it hasn't been rented out." The full name on the newspaper was Stellan Sammer. "Not at all. Please wait a moment." The maidservant bent her back politely. She rushed inside and reported to her mistress. Moments later, she came out again and ushered him in. She then helped him place his cane and luggage in the foyer and hung his coat and hat on a clothes rack in the same place. A warm blast of air inundated him, dispersing the chill Klein had brought in. He scanned the area and first saw a uniquely designed fireplace. He saw pieces of red, smokeless charcoal burning inside. Sammer's living room was rather big. It was nearly equivalent to the entire Moretti's first floor in area. Certain areas were decorated with carpets or oil paintings of beautiful sceneries. The maidservant brought Klein to the sofa and said to her mistress in a pale yellow dress, "Madam, the guest is here." The mistress was in her 30s. She had blonde hair and blue eyes. She looked rather pretty and had preserved her youthfulness well. She held a silver-inlaid feathered royal fan in her hand. As she was at home, and the fireplace made for a warm environment, she didn't wear anything around her neck, revealing her white bosom and shiny long neck. "Hello there, Mrs. Sammer." Klein pressed one palm to his chest and bowed. Mrs. Sammer smiled in a reserved manner. Good evening. Please, have a seat. Do you wish for some coffee or tea? Klein sat on the sofa and answered frankly, tea, please. Julianne, Marquis black tea, instructed Mrs. Sammer. She then turned her eyes to Klein and asked, how might I address you? Sherlock Moriarty. You can call me Sherlock. Klein had long thought of a fake name. At that moment, he caught a whiff of a fragrance from the kitchen and saw complicated pipes. Those are my husband's designs. Although his actual job is a manager at the coin company, he's a machinery enthusiast. He's also a member of the Kingdom Soot Reduction Association. Mrs. Sammer noticed Klein's gaze and explained with a smile. Mrs., there's no need to go into such detail. I'm not here on a blind date with your husband. Klein lampooned as he said without his smile waning, Mrs. Sammer, I wish to rent the Unit 15. Mrs. Sammer straightened her back as she sat elegantly. She said with a smile, I have to remind you of certain things. Unit 15 doesn't have such pipes, reclining chairs, card tables, mahogany kitchen cabinets, fine porcelain, silver cutlery, gold-plated tea sets, or removable carpets. She pointed at the things in her house as she introduced them, one after another. After she was done, she added, it originally belonged to my elder sister and brother-in-law, but due to a business failure, my brother-in-law had no choice but to move to the southern continent. They have a plantation at Balam. However, I don't agree with their choice. This is just too unfair for my niece and nephew. There are no good grammar schools there, not even a good home tutor. Mrs., that's not something I would like to know. Klein nodded sincerely and said, apart from the weather, there's no place in the southern continent that can compare with Backland. His agreement satisfied Mrs. Sammer greatly as her eyes darted slightly. This house still has a 3 years lease. I wish for you to pay a year's rent at once. 18 soldi a week. The use of the furniture will cost 1 soldi. I can collect a deposit of £50. Klein shook his head and smiled. Mrs. Sammer, you should be able to tell that I just arrived in Backland. I don't know what will happen to me in time. To pay £50 for a deposit will lower my ability to resist any risks. My limit is half a year. £25. He still planned on renting another one-bedroom apartment in Backland's East Borough. He would use it to change his clothes, undergo disguises, and shirk off any tailing. It was necessary for what he planned to do. Stellan nodded slightly and asked, have you studied at grammar school? Klein chuckled and said, yes, I later self-studied history. Do you have any identification with you? Asked Stellan casually. I'm sorry. I was in a hurry when I left home and forgot to bring it with me. I forgot to introduce myself. I'm from Mid-Seashire. Klein deliberately used the accent his classmate, Welch, often used. When he said, forgot, it reminded him of Captain Dunn Smith. The smile on his face turned even more brilliant. At this moment, the maidservant, Julianne, brought a cup of black tea over. The cup was porcelain white with classic flowery patterns. Some areas were plated in gold. Klein took a sip and found the fragrance distant. The mix of sourness and sweetness were perfect, and it was clearly much better than the Side black tea he often drank. Very authentic Marquis black tea. He complimented with a description which couldn't be faulted. Mrs. Stellan Sammer curled her lips and said, then, let's do half a year's rent. £25. Klein thanked her and engaged in a few minutes of idle chatter with her until another maidservant found a service contract from the study. After both parties signed the contract, Klein counted £25 while feeling the pinch and pushed it to Mrs. Sammer. Stellan counted it silently before smiling. Mr. Moriarty, I believe you'll be finding a job in Backland? Yes, Klein answered, feeling a little lost. The corners of Stellan's mouth hooked up. I can give you some suggestions. With a weekly salary lower than £3, it would be difficult for you to live in Sherwood Borough. Your rent, food expenses, water, gas, and charcoal expenses, transport expenses, and everything else added up will cost at least £2.5 solely. Believe me, this is Backlund. One still has to consider new clothes and good cutlery and tea sets. A weekly salary of £3 is the bare minimum. If your weekly salary reaches £5, you can hire a maidservant. At £6, you can consider hiring a chef. At £7, you can add a male servant. For £8, you can hire an additional maidservant, Mrs. Sammer, I think you are flaunting your wealth. I once earned more than £10 a week. Klein maintained his smile as he listened attentively. At that moment, the door suddenly opened. A stout man walked in. He was dressed in a black double-breasted suit and leather gloves of the same color. Above his lips were two elegant mustaches. Luke, this is Mr. Moriarty. He will be our neighbor. Stellan Sammer went forward and introduced him. Obviously the master of the house, Luke took off his coat and handed it to the male servant beside him. He smiled politely and said, Mr. Moriarty, would you like to join us for dinner? This is the manager of some coin company, a member of the Lone Kingdom Soot Reduction Association. Klein said with a smile, I'm very sorry, Mr. Sammer. I've eaten on the steam locomotive, although, that taste does leave a deep impression on one. After exchanging some pleasantries, Klein was led by Julianne out of the house and into the neighboring Unit 15. The layout was very similar to the unit next door. The first floor had a huge living room, a dining room with decent lighting, 2 guest rooms, a bathroom, a cellar, a kitchen that extended all the way back. On the second floor, there were 4 bedrooms, an activity room, a solarium, a study, 2 bedrooms, and a huge balcony. Mrs. Sammer wishes to tell you that you can rent out part of it, but not to workers or make this place too packed or noisy. Oh. I'll bring you clean blankets, sheets, and pillowcases in a while. Julianne returned to the Sammers after informing Klein. After doing a round of packing, Klein finally settled into Backlund. He sat in an empty living room and suddenly felt lonely. Hence, he forced himself to consider his future plans. Whether he liked it or not, revenge and advancement couldn't be done in the blink of an eye. Therefore, he had to obtain a lucrative job to prevent himself from facing any financial problems. However, the job couldn't restrict him and affect his movements and plans. In other words, he needed sufficient freedom. After some deliberation and eliminating unsuitable jobs, Klein was left with 3 choices. He could become an author by becoming a plagiarist. However, his identity was sensitive, so the more famous he became, the more trouble it meant. All he could do was give up unwillingly. The second choice was to be a news reporter. This was considered quite a decent job in this time and age. However, job applications required his educational certificates and other documents. Klein was helpless in that respect. Finally, he chose the third job. Private detective. This was also the reason why he had taken on a fake name. Chapter 216 Klein started his first morning in Backlund under cold and humid weather conditions, with a light fog that provided very little visibility. For breakfast, he had 1 liter worth of cheap tea, costing 1 penny, and 2 pieces of toast with inferior butter in the center. He was busy the entire morning, but he first went to the Sherwood Borough's Backlund Bulletin to post a tiny advertisement for a month at the cost of £30. From Tuesday, the Backlund Bulletin's loyal readers would see a tiny advertisement along the seams of its 7th and 8th page. Sherlock Moriarty. Good at various types of private investigations. Reasonable prices and strictly adheres to the principles of confidentiality. Resides at Sherwood Borough's 15, Minsk Street. The reason why Klein didn't choose major newspapers like the Tussock Times or the Backlund Daily Tribune, that had a readership all across the entirety of the Lone Kingdom, was due to the fact that his business was temporarily limited to Backlund. Furthermore, he didn't wish for a sterling reputation. Therefore, the Backlund Bulletin, which was well received locally and had low advertisement fees, became his first choice. After leaving the Backlund Bulletin's headquarters, Klein took out a map and followed it to purchase various herb powders and silver slices from various herbal stores, flower stores, jewelry stores, and accessory stores. He did it in preparation for holding a ritual. When items that didn't have any spirituality were involved, most of the materials in mysticism could be purchased from ordinary stores. However, they weren't all under one roof, requiring him to visit many stores to collect them. To do so, Klein spent another £5. The humongous sum of £200 that he withdrew broke below the £100 mark, leaving him only with £92. Spending money is as easy as drinking water. Klein found a small cafeteria nearby and ordered a black pepper steak worth 8 pence. He returned to 15 Minsk Street at 1 in the afternoon, and without rest, he spent his time using slumber flower, dragon blood grass, dark red sandalwood, and mint powders to create holy night powder, a key ingredient needed to create a wall of spirituality. He could only make do with this method until he bought a real silver ritual dagger. Klein speculated that he would have to advance to sequence 7 before he could do away with this restriction. Phew, Miss Justice, Mr. Hanged Man, and the Son haven't requested for leave yet. The gathering will be held on time today. I wonder what surprises Mr. Hanged Man will bring me, and how many pages of Roselle's diary he can provide. Klein laid back on his bed in the bedroom and thought about all sorts of things. To him, a private detective was a career that took into account both money and action. It allowed him to get in touch with people from all walks of life and slowly discover the Beyonder Circle in Backlund. From there, he could slowly find clues regarding the secret order. Of course, if he was lucky, he would even be able to figure out the sequence 7 which corresponded to the clown through a particular circle of Beyonders and by the corresponding potion formula and main ingredients. As for Zangwill's whereabouts, Klein temporarily chose not to take the initiative to seek him out. He might even avoid him a little. However, if he were to accidentally discover this enemy of his, without exposing himself, he wouldn't mind doing a good deed and sending an anonymous letter to the Church of the Evernight Goddess. A private detective's income can, at most, support a middle-class standard of living. If I want enough money to buy the potion formula and Beyonder materials, it will either depend on Miss Justice, or it will be through investments with the remaining £100 that I have left in my anonymous account. Yes, I can't touch the £92 that I have for the time being. Perhaps, I wouldn't be having any income for some time. With this in mind, Klein suddenly sat up. He came to the first floor and began reading the various newspapers he bought in passing. These newspapers often carried news about what had been invented and required investments, or how someone wished to form a joint venture with others to do a particular business. Klein relied on his knowledge from Earth and his understanding of this era to carefully sift through the projects. Unfortunately, none of the ones on the papers today were reliable. At 15 minutes to 3, he returned to his bedroom, locked the door, drew the curtains, and used holy night powder to create a wall of spirituality. Klein took 4 steps counterclockwise and arrived above the grey fog. He sat in the high-back chair belonging to the Fool before extending his spirituality and touching the crimson star that symbolized the sun as if he was responding to a prayer. This is one of the few things in my new life that hasn't changed, he suddenly sighed. In an area outside of the City of Silver, in a grayish-black tower that was half-collapsed. 9 members of a patrol squad were gathered around a blazing bonfire, chatting about their experiences in the past few days. There were also a few other team members guarding the perimeter, prepared for any possible attacks that might break out from the darkness. Many of the City of Silver's Beyonders had used their blood to teach them a lesson: at all times, never let your guard down. The monsters in the darkness could very well be right behind you. On a night when the frequency of lightning was very low, it was necessary to keep the flames burning and the light shining. Once they were completely enveloped in darkness, it wasn't impossible for them to all disappear. No one could say for sure just what terrible things would happen in total darkness, because reality had broken the limits of their imagination time and time again. Derek Berg remained reserved and silent as he quietly listened to his companions reminiscing about the monster they had encountered before. It was a humanoid monster with eyes covering its entire body. In order to finish off the monster, their patrolling team suffered a heavy price with 5 injured, and 2 of them severely injured. Suddenly, Derek's vision blurred, and he felt himself being enveloped in a thick gray mist. In an inexplicably far-away place, in the depths of the gray fog, a blurry figure sat on an ancient high-back chair, looking down at him. "Prepare for the gathering." The fool's voice echoed in Derek's ears, but none of his teammates were aware of it. After withdrawing his gaze and observing the area for more than 10 seconds, Derek moved to the very edge of the fire, leaned against the broken wall, and pretended to be asleep. Ever since he found out that the members of the 6-member council and Elder Lovia were unable to discover the existence of Mr. Fool, he gradually believed that as long as he didn't carelessly reveal any clues, he would be able to quietly attend the tarot club's gathering above the gray fog even under the gaze of others. Backlund, Empress Borough. Using the excuse that she was tired, Audrey returned to her bedroom. She curbed her excitement and didn't pace back and forth. Instead, she sat quietly on the bed, waiting for Mr. Fool's summoning. Father was busy communicating with the other members of Parliament about the proposed bill, and the Beyonder Guard isn't tailing me constantly. Thank you, Goddess, my life has finally returned to normal. 2 weeks have passed, Mr. Hanged Man must have prepared the pituitary gland of a mature rainbow salamander. I'm about to advance to sequence 8. Audrey thought with sparkling eyes. To her, this was even more exciting and worth looking forward to than the £30,000 bounty and the large plantation worth at least £8,000. Finally, she saw the familiar illusory crimson surge towards her like a tidal wave, drowning her. On an ancient-looking sailboat. Alger Wilson locked the door to the captain's cabin and sat behind a sextant and the ship logs. He kept memorizing the contents of the thick stack of sheets in front of him. After the investigations, he left the bustle of Backlund without any qualms after being rewarded by the upper echelons and returned to the sea, carrying a batch of secretly copied Roselle diary pages. After digesting the seafarer potion, I'll be able to advance normally. My contributions are enough for me to trade for the formula and ingredients. However, this will expose the fact that I know the acting method. There are advantages and disadvantages. Alger shook his head, suddenly distracted. At that moment, he felt the summoning of the fool. His mind suddenly recalled the face of Rear Admiral Hurricane Kalangos, whose flesh and blood quickly rotted as pieces of his face peeled off. Alger instinctively lowered his head, allowing the crimson tide to engulf him. Above the gray fog, inside the palace that looked like a giant's residence. Having activated his spirit vision, Klein examined Justice, the Hanged Man, and the Sun to confirm their current states. Audrey was about to happily greet everyone when she suddenly saw the Hanged Man gesturing to her before rushing to speak before her. Mr. Fool, I've obtained 19 pages of Roselle's diary this time. Here, I must thank you for sending your adorer to help me get rid of Kalangos. These diary pages will be the compensation I should pay. 19 pages? Not bad. Klein didn't talk much about the adorer as he smiled faintly. That is the principle of equivalent exchange. As expected of Mr. Fool. A pirate admiral with a mystical item was nothing to him. From the looks of it, I don't have to mention my claiming of the bounty. I wonder how many high-sequence Beyonders Mr. Fool has as his adorers. Audrey had begun to use the word he, him, or his, to refer to the fool without realizing it. Upon hearing the fool's answer, Alger said humbly, the limit of my current memory is 6 pages. Please allow me to give them to you over separate occasions. No problem. Klein, who was surrounded by thick gray fog, nodded gently. The son Derek looked at the pages that appeared before the hanged man and was very curious about the contents of the diary. With his previous experiences, he believed that the items that Mr. Fool was interested in definitely contained many mysteries. He looked at Miss Justice, and when he saw that she didn't have the impulse to ask, he cautiously maintained his silence. Soon, the 6 pages of the diary were complete and came into Klein's hands. Audrey and the others began to wait quietly. They were already used to such things. Klein looked down and read the first page, 16th December. I managed to contact the pathetic fellow who's trapped in the storm and was lost in the darkness. Finally, there's a follow-up to one of the previous pages of the diary. Klein was delighted, and he became more focused. He called himself Mr. Door and tried to teach me a complicated and difficult ritual. He wanted me to help him return to the real world and promised to fulfill 3 of my requests. Does he think I'm stupid? I've lived for more than 60 years over my 2 lives. Does he think I can't tell that this is the usual manipulation done by evil gods and devils? But the history of the 4th epoch that he described was truly interesting. Chapter 217 Mr. Door. This naming style is very similar to mine. I wonder what was the real name of this pathetic fellow who was lost and trapped in the deep darkness amidst the storms is, and what his sequence is. Or rather, just as Emperor Roselle had guessed, he's one of the evil gods or devils. Klein let out a silent chuckle which was mixed with ridicule and self-deprecating humor. He was also interested in the history of the 4th epoch. I know of the most famous War of the 4 Emperors in the 4th epoch, but the specific details and the main figures involved are limited to the information spread by the major churches. For example, the Dark Emperor of the Solomon Empire. It wasn't until today that this so-called Mr. Door finally answered my questions by letting me know who the remaining 3 emperors are. The half-insane Blood Emperor of the Tudor dynasty, the Night Emperor of the Trunsoist Empire, and the Emperor of the Underworld of the Southern Continent, also known as Death. According to Mr. Door's description, in this war that changed the situation of the entire world, the Dark Emperor, Blood Emperor and Night Emperor fell one after another. The Emperor of the Underworld reaped the greatest benefits. Having said that, Mr. Door added with profound significance that after over a century of digestion, Death went mad, but he also became stronger. Therefore, Death teamed up with the primordial Demonis and brought about a pale disaster for the northern continent. Of course, this isn't something he witnessed personally, but rather something that he hears when he comes close to the real world every month. Death went mad, but also became stronger. Even deities can go mad. What a horrifying sentence. However, this also confirms my guess. Before the 5th epoch, those deities would often descend into the real world, directly interfering with the situation in the northern and southern continents. They might even personally appear just like Death. I asked Mr. Door if he had participated in the War of the 4 Emperors. If so, what role did he play? And what was the position the 7 deities maintained in this war? What role did they play? Mr. Door didn't answer my question. He only said in a teasing manner that the number of preeminent mighty figures in the 4th epoch far exceeds my imagination. In addition, he also mentioned 2 laws, one is the law of beyonder characteristics indestructibility, and the other is the law of similar sequence beyonder characteristics conservation, which is consistent with certain things that I have learned from that most secret and ancient organization, and also from some of the phenomena I have observed. This can lead to many interesting conclusions, making many explanations take on other forms, making one's mind tremble in horror. For example, when there are too many high-sequence beyonders in the same sequence pathway, the low-sequence beyonders would reduce, and vice versa. The beyonder characteristics had been fixed at the source. It will not increase or decrease. Does this mean that there really is a God who created all the deities, an omnipotent and omniscient God, and everything originated from him? This was the longest Roselle diary that Klein had ever seen. It took up 2 full pages, and one could imagine that it originally came on a double-sided page. It only became 2 separate pages after repeated copying. That's a lot of information. Klein sighed silently. As a history student who had graduated normally, he had always believed that the Solomon Empire, the Tudor dynasty, and the Trunsoist Empire came one after the other in a line, with a certain degree of restoration before a new political outcome was established. To his surprise, the War of the Four Emperors described by Mr. Dorr clearly and unambiguously revealed one thing: all 3 empires had existed at the same time. If this were true, then it would really overturn most of the current research on the Fourth Epoch in the field of history. Klein suddenly thought of the original Klein, who was filled with interest towards archaeology and the history regarding the Fourth Epoch. Today, I've helped him achieve his wish. I wonder if death had already become a true deity during the War of the Four Emperors. It's hard to determine according to Mr. Dorr's descriptions. I can only first assume that the Emperor of the Underworld, who had obtained benefits from the War of the Four Emperors, had broken through his limits and become a deity, but he also went mad as a result. To have a deity go mad was truly terrifying. Just thinking about the details makes one tremble from the bottom of their heart. It's no wonder that the knowledgeable Emperor Roselle would use the word horrifying to describe this matter. Could it be that the so-called evil gods were crazy orthodox deities? Would that mean that there might only be evil gods left in this world one day? Man, does this mean that the end of days cannot be stopped? Klein smiled to hide the growing solemnity of his emotions. He felt that the future he imagined was filled with a dark gray hue. At the same time, he raised his evaluation of the Dark Emperor, Blood Emperor, and Night Emperor, believing them to be the preeminent mighty figures who were close to being deities. Perhaps that means Sequence 1 is the peak existence of a single pathway. According to this logic, for Dark Emperor to live for centuries or over a millennium wouldn't be unacceptable. That would explain the original Klein's confusion. He had obtained contradictory findings from the content recorded in the Antigonus family's notebook with his own mentor's viewpoint. He believed that the Dark Emperor was the common name used by every emperor of the Solomon Empire. Perhaps, the Dark Emperor had always been the same Dark Emperor. Of course, other possibilities cannot be eliminated. For example, they could have been replaced 2 or 3 times, but is the name of that pathway's Sequence 1, Dark Emperor? I wonder who Mr. Dorr is in the history of the Fourth Epoch. Emperor Roselle didn't go into detail when describing his erroneous experiments and accidental coincidences, making it impossible for me to even try to converse with that Mr. Dorr. The laws of Beyonder characteristics indestructibility and similar sequence Beyonder characteristics conservation shares the same description as the one used by the captain. Perhaps, the term he used came from Emperor Roselle. According to the 2 laws described by Mr. Dorr, we can indeed deduce a lot of interesting speculations. For example, with there being so many holy artifacts and high-sequence Beyonders in the 7 churches, there shouldn't be many low-sequence Beyonders. But this contradicts reality, and the only reasonable explanation is an additional gift from the deities. For example, is the destruction of the nation of the Evernight due to the conservation of characteristics, that the mere possession of resources causes it to be in trouble? Or could it be said that their existence seriously weakens the potency of the Evernight pathway and threatens the position of the goddess? For example, theoretically speaking, certain sealed artifacts could also be used as the main ingredients for potion materials, or they can even be considered equivalent to potions. Of course, the prerequisite is to remove all latent dangers and madness. No wonder the documents that were unearthed called the Fourth Epoch, the Epoch of the Gods. So it turns out that in this epoch, there are many records of deities descending. Then what caused them to stop coming, to the point of there not being any revelations? If it wasn't for the fact that Beyonders receive responses from ritualistic magic, perhaps many of them would have doubted the existence of the deities. Many ideas came to Klein suddenly as he felt that he had delved deeper into the realm of mysticism in this Beyonder world. He flipped through the next 4 pages and was disappointed to realize that they were no longer related to Mr. Door. His ability as a clown allowed him to conceal his emotions well, and coupled with the grey fog's obstruction, even Audrey, who was secretly observing him, didn't notice anything amiss. He gathered his chaotic thoughts and started reading the 3rd page of the diary, 10th September. I've endured it for a long time, but I still can't help but complain a little. I must have had F*** king sh** for brains to chose the savant path, right? Of course, this has indeed allowed me to develop my greatest advantage, allowing the church to attach great importance to me. But the problem is that the first few sequences lack any beyonder powers needed for combat. I can only make do by relying on mystical items and rely way too much on external items. For example, Sequence 9 Savant only has extraordinary abilities in memory, learning, and practical skills. For example, Sequence 8 Archaeologist gains a strong physique and corresponding ancient knowledge, and they can only barely apply some ritualistic magic. For example, Sequence 7 Appraiser, whose ability is to quickly identify mystical objects, allowing them to avoid hidden dangers to the greatest extent. For example, Sequence 6 Artisan, who can produce machinery wonder but not very powerful beyonder objects. Apart from that, one standard in ritualistic magic will be enhanced. It's no wonder its modern name is Machinery Specialist. Comparatively speaking, the Sequence 7 Warlock and Sequence 6 Scrolls Professor of the Mystery Prior pathway are sufficiently tempting. It would be great if only the Church has the complete sequence and that the hidden sage doesn't exist. However, I finally received some good news. After I advance again, I'll gain beyonder powers combat powers that I can call my own. Sequence 5 Astromancer. Its modern name scares me a little. It's actually called Astronomer. Am I going to end up as an all-powerful mad scientist? Heavens have mercy on me. I was only a second-tier student at the college entrance examination. It had to be said that Emperor Roselle had a strange talent for making jokes. Even the recently dispirited Klein couldn't help but twitch his mouth, wishing to light a candle for this senior. Study hard and improve by the day is indeed a wise saying. He lampooned and remembered the unique trait of the Church of the God of Steam and Machinery. They lacked beyonder powers when it came to combat, but they were good at making and using items. After flipping to the 3rd page of the diary, Klein continued reading, June 2nd, the kingdom has created chaos, again and again, instigating wars without being able to completely destroy the Faysac Empire, the Lone Kingdom, and the Fainapotter Kingdom. As such, the kingdom has no choice but to shoulder huge debts, and its economy is on the verge of collapse. From my observations, the people, merchants, and soldiers are very dissatisfied. The riots are just lacking a spark. This is my chance. But I have to be very careful. The Sauron family has witnessed the history of the 4th epoch and is an ancient family with a high possibility of having high-sequence beyonders. I need the support of the Church, as well as gain a tacit agreement with the Church of the Eternal Blazing Sun. I can't appear immediately. First, I'll let the rebels destroy order before I end it all as a protector. Consul Roselle Gustave. I like that name. Chapter 218, 218 June 3rd. After discussing with Edwards and the others, I gave up on the idea of reaching a tacit understanding with the Church of the Eternal Blazing Sun. This might very well reveal my true intentions, making the Sauron family and the ancient nobles who support them aware of them in advance and carry out a direct approach. That would make matters extremely difficult and dangerous. It's a pity that Grimm died in the Sea of Fog. He was the smartest among us. Descend into chaos. Descend. Only with everything in chaos will I get the chance to fish in troubled waters. Only when the Sauron family is incapable of handling this situation will the Church of the Eternal Blazing Sun reluctantly acknowledge me. Perhaps I should give some help to those rebels, but how should I conceal myself so that no one would notice? June 4th, Zeradal from the Secret Order came to visit me in incognito very suddenly. And then? Klein was just feeling intrigued over the reason why Zeradal, leader of the secret order, would seek Roselle on the eve of the rebellion and coup d'état when he realized that the two subsequent pages had nothing to do with it. This made him feel a sense of irrepressible anger. Although the 3 diary pages didn't provide very detailed descriptions, with rather straightforward accounts from Roselle, Klein could still feel the famous turmoil in Intis that happened in 1173, more than 100 years ago. The outcome was clearly recorded in history textbooks. As a colonel, Republic quashed the rebellion and enacted political changes. The Intis kingdom was transformed into a republic, with him acting as a self-appointed consul. In the following 19 years, he reformed the penal code, encouraged inventions, and protected the Industrial Revolution. He greatly increased the country's strength and fought wars both north and south, making Lemberg, Mason, Seeger, and other countries protectorates under the Intis Republic. He also made the 3 mighty countries on the northern continent, the Faesac Empire, the Lone Kingdom, and the Fanapotter Kingdom, bow their heads. At the end of 1192, almost 20 years after his appointment as consul, Roselle converted the republic into an empire, declaring himself Caesar. Less than 6 years later, he perished in the White Maple Palace, ending the 5th epoch's most legendary piece of history to date. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that there was more to Roselle's death than what appeared on the surface. It was just like how this famous historical event definitely had power struggles amongst Beyonders behind it, and that a Beyonder faction had leveled the situation, unlike the descriptions in textbooks. As expected, one of the so-called 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, Grimm, died in the Sea of Fog. In a previous diary page, Roselle had written that there was something wrong with this horseman. It seems to have something to do with the tiny island where they discovered many extraordinary beings. Not only was it a fortuitous encounter, but it was also a dangerous one. Klein thought of a previous entry and turned to the 5th page, feeling emotional. The contents of this page are of little value. They consist of Roselle's comments after drinking an 1128 Ormer red wine, the disillusion of finding the woman who had gained his adoration in his youth to be aged and out of shape, as well as a degenerate summary of a certain period when he was addicted to playing cards. The 6th page was about the same as the first one, with accounts of his daily life. However, the last one made Klein's eyes light up. April 8, I have to send someone to investigate the secret order to get more information. I can't repeat my passiveness from before. I can't let Zeradal lead me by the nose anymore. So, did you discover anything, Comrade Roselle? Since Klein couldn't find the rest of the information, he could only force himself to calm down and wait for the next gathering when the hanged man would hand over another 6 pages. He knew that an investigation from over 100 years ago was unlikely to help him find any clues related to the Secret Order Association. After all, over such a long period of time, other than the special ones, many of the high-sequence Beyonders would have already died of old age, not to mention the middle or low-level members. However, Klein believed that this would help him obtain inspiration and grasp the precise identity and activity patterns that the Secret Order often used. Putting down the 6 diary pages, Klein tapped his right index finger on the edge of the long bronze table, slowly moving his gaze from Miss Justice to the hanged man, and then to the sun. Right, in the diary just now, there was a line Emperor Roselle described, God who created all the deities, an omnipotent and omniscient God. This is very similar to the customs of the City of Silver. Where did he hear this from? Could it be from that most ancient and secret organization which controls the world from behind the scenes? This organization was established before the forsaken land of the gods was forsaken. Suddenly, Klein had a new idea. He said with a low and gentle smile, Roselle mentioned some hidden history in his diary, and mentioned some simple general knowledge. The latter reminded me of something that I don't recall informing you all. Audrey suddenly fell into a trance. She immediately turned her body around and looked at the very top of the ancient long table in pleasant surprise. Mr. Fool is taking the initiative to mention the contents of Roselle's diary. What would it say? She was so excited and thrilled that she completely forgot that she was a spectator. Compared to her, the hanged man, Alger, was much more composed. However, the subconscious straightening of his back heartlessly betrayed him. Only the son, Derek, had always believed that the items of interest to Mr. Fool contained many mysteries, but he didn't know anything about Emperor Roselle and didn't know what this name represented in the northern continent. Thus, he just found it difficult to hide his curiosity and didn't reveal any unusual behavior. Mr. Fool, did Emperor Roselle mention some general knowledge? I'm willing to pay for this information, Audrey couldn't help but say. However, I want it to be communicated to me privately. She added silently in her heart. Klein chuckled and said, there's no need. This is very simple general knowledge. After reading this part of the diary, as the summoner of the Tarot Club, I feel it's necessary to let all of you know this. Of course, I'm very certain that some of you are already aware of this. He was mainly referring to the sun. The City of Silver had a history of 2,000 to 3,000 years, so it was impossible for them to not discover the law of Beyonder characteristics indestructibility. Moreover, they were in a relatively extreme environment. Even if the surrounding areas had no lack of monsters in the darkness, there would still be times when they failed to obtain the corresponding materials. In order to pass on their heritage, in order for their city to continue on, using the Beyonder characteristics of the remains of their predecessors to create a potion wasn't particularly unacceptable. To them, this was perhaps a sacred and glorious ceremony. Of course, Klein could see from a previous exchange that the hanged man knew something. It's a pity that Miss Justice cannot always be made to pay in gold pounds and transfer the money to my adorers. My adorer can't appear any less impressive. I mustn't destroy the image of the powerful man that Mr. Azik has created. Yes, I'll give it a try when I have the chance. After all, no matter how powerful a being is, they'll have subordinates that run errands. For instance, the Evernight goddess is sleepless. No one would ever suspect that the Evernight goddess isn't a true deity just because the low-level Nighthawks are weak. Klein sighed silently. Thank you very much. Mr. Fool, you are just too generous. Audrey replied in joy. She was originally feeling 3 seconds of regret for the coarse action of using cash to purchase the information. Klein stopped rapping the table and described with a calm voice, the first piece of general knowledge, law of Beyonder characteristics indestructibility. The characteristics of a Beyonder is never destroyed or reduced. It's only passed from one carrier to the next. Without realizing it, I used Captain's tone. Klein's lips subconsciously curled upwards. It cannot be destroyed or reduced. It just transfers from one carrier to another. Audrey ruminated over Mr. Fool's description, feeling that there was too much meaning in that simple sentence. Her emerald green eyes turned, and when she saw that neither the hanged man nor the sun showed any signs of surprise or contemplation, she immediately understood that these two members of the Tarot Club had long known of this law. Only I didn't know. She thought, feeling somewhat aggrieved, but she quickly began to praise Mr. Fool for his kindness. At this point, Klein added, after a rampager dies, they will leave behind an item of Beyonder characteristics. It could be the main ingredient, or it could be a mystical artifact that requires sealing. An ordinary Beyonder's death results in similar results. However, the item left behind will be equivalent to the corresponding potion without the supplementary ingredients. Of course, the item alone will contain Beyonder powers. They can be used as a half-mystical object. The plain and indifferent words instantly echoed in Audrey's mind. Layers stacked upon layers and, bit by bit, it eventually reached a crescendo. Audrey thought of cannibalism and the question, would a sequence pathway be severed if the source of Beyonder materials ceased to exist? She had asked the hanged man previously came to mind. Now, she knew the answer, but she would have rather not heard it. She felt like she was having a nightmare. How can it be so cruel? Why is it so dark? Audrey had previously seen some bad situations that involved Beyonders, but those situations were only caused by a person's own perverse and evil nature. For example, Mr. A or Kilangos. They didn't affect her yearning and love for mysticism and the beyonder world. However, this time, she discovered that the mystical world was filled with grayness and darkness. Wake up, Audrey, you can't be naive. Consider that the cruelty and darkness described by Mr. Fool are predictable. Since he had chosen this path, he had to bravely walk down it. Audrey consoled herself, easing her mood a little. She saw that the Hanged Man and the Sun were making only habitual movements and appeared to understand what had just been said. Humph. Mr. Hanged Man is terrible. He even wanted to use this information as an exchange previously. Ugh. This information is indeed worth a lot and is quite important, but it's only a simple piece of general knowledge to us and Mr. Fool. Audrey suddenly wanted to laugh a little. Her mood began to improve, and she slowly pushed all the extreme examples that she had just thought of aside. Klein wasn't surprised by the three members' reaction. He continued in a calm tone, the second piece of general knowledge, law of similar sequence beyonder characteristics conservation. Law of similar sequence beyonder characteristics conservation. The Hanged Man slightly changed his sitting posture. He felt that he understood something, but he was unable to fully understand what this law represented and what it consisted of. Justice and the Sun shared the same feelings as he did. They were unable to directly understand the true meaning behind this law. Why similar sequence? Alger couldn't help asking. Klein smiled and replied, "What do you wish to pay for the answer?" One of the ideas he had was that general knowledge was free, but any explanation required a fee. This both matched his status and didn't waste the information. Free things cost the most. Chapter 219. If the Fool had simply mentioned that there was some simple general knowledge contained in Roselle's diary, the Hanged Man, Alger, wouldn't necessarily be determined to pay the price for the answer, partly because the description of it being simple killed his curiosity. Another aspect stemmed from his constant wariness against making trades with the Fool, as it reminded him of the examples when deals were made with evil gods and devils. But now that he knew the so-called contents of simple general knowledge, his interest was piqued. Yet, he was unable to understand parts of the description, much less gain any actual or deep grasp of the concept. Therefore, he couldn't hold back his urges to ask in absolute reverence, "Mr. Fool, what kind of payment do you want?" "Yes, yes." Justice Audrey nodded her head nearly indiscernibly but very frequently, indicating that this was something she wanted to ask as well. Although the Sun Derek remained silent and didn't make any additional body gestures, the look he gave to the Fool explained everything. Klein, who was waiting for such a response, smiled and said, "Information regarding the secret order." The secret order. The Hanged Man Alger muttered to himself. He wasn't unfamiliar with this term. He had once received payment for explaining to Miss Justice about many secret organizations, including the secret order. Audrey and Derek both frowned subconsciously. The former's only understanding of the secret order was limited to what the Hanged Man had described. And the latter had never even heard of such an organization. Klein had long anticipated what the Sun would feel, but he wasn't surprised. According to his conjecture, the area where the City of Silver was located should have been a part of the third epoch after the appearance of the first blasphemy slate and before the appearance of the second blasphemy slate. It was even possible that it was the direct catalyst or manifestation of the cataclysm. The Zeradal family had only stepped onto the stage of history in the fourth epoch, and the secret order was created in the latter half of the fourth epoch. There was no way both entities could have existed in the same period. It would surprise Klein if the Sun were to know about the secret order. He would then have to overturn some of his speculations, reconstruct his knowledge of the City of Silver, the forsaken land of the gods, and the Zeradal family. After nearly 20 seconds of silence, Alger looked at the Fool in the grey fog, deliberated his words and said, "I will accept this request and help you gather information regarding the secret order." "Can you make payment in advance?" It wasn't surprising that a suspected deity was interested in an ancient and secret organization, therefore, Alger wasn't puzzled about it. More importantly, after many gatherings, he had a guess in his mind, which was that Mr. Fool's state wasn't perfect, that he might be in a predicament, that all his attempts and the actions of his adorers on the northern and southern continents were to help him break free from his confines. This might even be related to the huge secret of why the seven deities no longer descend upon the real world after the fourth epoch. A thought flashed through Alger's mind, and he shuddered as he felt himself entering the realm of the gods. Upon hearing the hanged man's request, Klein leaned back in his chair and nodded. No problem. If the information you have collected exceeds the value of the answer, I will provide you with further compensation. As for the circumstances in which the value of the answer was lacking, it is naturally up to the esteemed Mr. Fool to decide. If he has the ability to make the additional payment, so be it. If not, forget it. Klein silently added. Justice Audrey's eyes lit up all of a sudden. She raised her hand and said, I want to partake in this deal. Klein laughed and replied, sure. Frankly speaking, his main target was Miss Justice because she was a local of Backlund and she had mixed herself into several Beyonder circles. Her access to information in the Land of Hope far exceeded his, considering it was his first time in the capital. She was also more informed than the hanged man who was out at sea most of the time. According to the earlier revelation he received from his divination, Klein believed that the clues related to the secret order would appear in Backlund and not anywhere else. The son Derek listened quietly and after some thought, said, I'm willing to use the payment I reserved and exchange it for the answer. In the previous three-way deal, he had traded the Sequence 8 telepathist formula for Sequence 9 Bard. Klein had promised to compensate him, and his choice at the time had been to save it up and prepare for the subsequent potion formulas and main ingredients. Klein nodded his head and gave an explanation that he had long prepared. The so-called similar sequence refers to how high-sequence Beyonders are exchangeable with other pathways. Let me give an example. The Death Pathway's Sequence 5, Gatekeeper, can not only be advanced normally, but one can also choose the Giant Pathway, which is the Gatekeeper Pathway's Sequence 4, Demon Hunter. This won't lead to the danger of losing control, nor will it accumulate madness. It's different from taking the wrong potion. Of course, if it's not a similar sequence, a semi-deranged state is the best result. Exchangeable? Audrey blurted out, surprised and delighted. She was surprised that sequence pathways weren't completely fixed, that they didn't need to follow the original path all the way. The price of switching wasn't being semi-deranged and never to advance again. Within the 22 divine pathways, there were special circumstances and sequences which were similar. And what delighted her was that she had another chance to choose again in the future. It was just like being able to select something that caught her interest at Philip's department store. It was a wonderful experience. So that's how it is. Alger silently muttered to himself, suddenly feeling like he had understood several things at once, and he had resolved many of the doubts accumulated in his past experiences. This information is way too valuable. As expected of Mr. Fool. So-called simple general knowledge is enough to shock and awe most low-sequence Beyonders and benefit them immensely. He sighed inwardly. Derek the son was a little disappointed because he had no intention of changing sequences. He wanted to be the sun that lit up the darkness and dispelled the curse. However, he quickly recalled an incident that happened in the City of Silver. The former chief, a powerhouse who had the greatest possibility of breaking past the limitations of Demon Hunter, had built a mausoleum for himself and went deep inside, making it his home. Afterwards, he appeared less and less, until the main door of the mausoleum could no longer be opened. Back then, the citizens of the City of Silver all believed that a problem had arisen during the chief's advancement and that he had gone mad, to the point of being close to losing control. He was believed to have finished himself off. Now, combined with the description from the fool, the son suddenly thought of another possibility. That chief might have been attempting to advance in sequence through a similar pathway. In one of his explorations deep into the darkness, he had acquired the corresponding formula for the death pathway, and the mausoleum might have been a special requirement. But in the end, he still failed. But why didn't he turn into a monster? What did he encounter in that dark mausoleum? The City of Silver doesn't have the subsequent sequence potion formulas after Demon Hunter. As these thoughts crossed his mind, Derek was suddenly jolted back to his senses by Miss Justice's reserved voice. Mr. Fool, may I ask what other pathways are exchangeable with the Spectator Sequencer pathway? Sequence 4 Demon Hunter sounds pretty good. That's very suitable for me, very suitable for Justice. Audrey admired the first high sequence name that she knew. I want to know too. Klein was tempted to answer Miss Justice's question in such a manner. Before he could say anything, Audrey added in a faltering tone, I can pay for the answer to this question. How many gold pounds do you think is enough? I believe that your adorer will need a certain amount of funds for their activities. Having said that, she recalled how Mr. Fool's adorer had easily finished Pirate Admiral Kalangos who possessed creeping hunger. Clearly, he was a high-sequence beyonder, so she nearly said, I apologize. Mr. Fool, treat it as though I never said a thing. However, since she had already asked, she couldn't back down. Come on, Audrey. Perhaps the fool has a weaker adorer. Audrey quietly bit at her lips, silently encouraging herself. Gold pounds? Klein thought about it seriously and said, we'll make the transaction after enough information about the secret order is gathered. As he spoke, he recalled his informant in the Psychology Alchemists, Daxter Guderian. Captain and II. Sigh. Daxter's identity as an informant can no longer be verified. I wonder if it's a tragedy or a comedy. It's a pity that I can no longer contact him anymore. Otherwise, it would be the most convenient way to obtain the information regarding the Spectator pathway from him. Klein smirked. All right. Audrey answered happily. The conversation between the two made the hanged man, who was about to ask a similar question, shut his mouth. He left it until he had gathered enough information on the secret order. After a brief silence, Audrey turned her head to look at Mr. Fool and raised her hand very slightly. After receiving a nod of confirmation, she turned to the member opposite her and asked with a sense of anticipation, Mr. Hanged man, my tip allowed you to finish Rear Admiral Hurricane. Have you prepared the complete pituitary gland of a mature rainbow salamander? That's one of the reasons why I returned to the sea. Alger nodded gently and said, I've gotten the Beyonder material you wanted. But how should I give it to you? How? How should it be given to me? Audrey froze for a moment as she lost herself in thought. It's impossible to just give my address. Nor can I go through Zio and Furs. That will reveal the fact that I'm a Beyonder. It's not impossible. Emperor Roselle once said that when we should choose the lesser of two evils, at that moment, Klein's heart stirred. He lightly tapped the edge of the long table and smiled. Sir, are you willing to cooperate with me in making an attempt regarding this matter? Chapter 220 Attempt. Justice was instantly thrilled as she nodded her, acting reserved and elegant. I'm very willing to cooperate. As a spectator, she clearly remembered that Mr. Fool had only used the word attempt on two things. The first time involved bringing her and the hanged man into this mysterious space, and the second time was when they were given an honorary name so that they could attempt to make a prayer. And the outcome was sufficiently successful, revealing his true nature. What would it be this time? It really is something to look forward to. Audrey restrained her impatience and tried her best to behave as a qualified spectator. Attempt. Alger suddenly tensed up, viewing the fool's proposal with utmost wariness. What does he want to do? What is his true purpose? Is this good or bad for me? One by one, thoughts popped up in his mind. The rapidly rotting appearance of Rear Admiral Hurricane Kalangos surfaced in Alger's mind. Finally, he lowered his head and respectfully replied, "Your wish is my wish." Beside him, Derek looked at the hanged man, and then at Justice, wondering why they were so sensitive to this so-called attempt. Klein lightly tapped his fingers on the edge of the long bronze table and smiled. "This attempt will make your transaction easier and safer, and it will definitely be sufficiently confidential." He turned his head to the side and looked at the hanged man. He said with a moderate pace, "Do you remember the sacrificial ritual described by the sun?" Klein had deliberately mentioned it to show how open he was. It made it difficult for the members of the Tarot Club to imagine that the sacrificial ceremony he was about to provide had actually first been obtained from the sun and that he had gone through all that time and effort back then to trick the sun out of a template sacrificial ritual. "I remember. I do come into contact with such things usually," Alger answered truthfully, but his heart was throbbing. Since the Orthodox gods rarely responded to similar rituals, the word sacrifice had often been equated to evil gods and devils in the Fifth Epoch. Thinking about how this could lead to a terrifying outcome, the hanged man felt as if he was walking at the edge of the abyss. If he wasn't careful, he would fall in, only to be eroded and devoured. Klein followed his plans and didn't provide further explanations. He nodded slightly and said, "My idea is for you to sacrifice the Beyonder material to me through the ritual and I'll bestow them to Miss Justice. A transaction like this will be beneficial for both of you." "That can be done." Audrey was instantly dumbfounded. She felt that this exceeded the limits of her imagination. But she very quickly came to her senses and understood the advantages of this method and the true nature of a deity hidden behind this simple act. "Mr. Fool is great. As expected, our Tarot Club will be different from the other secret organizations. We'll use the method of deities to exchange for material goods and ingredients." Audrey almost said, "Praise the lady," in her mind out of habit, but in the end, she said, "Praise Mr. Fool," instead. Alger turned even warier as he entered a state of calm thoughts. "Honorable Mr. Fool, what do I need to do?" He tried to figure out the true purpose of the fool from the process of the sacrificial ritual. Klein lightly pressed his right hand and said, "Like I said, this is only an attempt. It might not succeed, so it will need your cooperation. First of all, prepare an altar. There's no need to make it too complicated, it can be very simple and crude. The only requirement is to engrave or draw this symbol." As he spoke, a screen of light appeared in front of him. On it was the symbol of the hidden, pupilless eye, and the mysterious symbol of the partial contorted lines, the same symbol on the back of the fool's chair. After previous experiments without using materials with spirituality, Klein was certain that the sacrificial ceremony he designed could create an illusory gate above the gray fog, similar to the door of summoning. However, his strength alone couldn't construct a stable channel, and he could only use the uniqueness of the mysterious space above the gray fog to complete the sacrifice. Therefore, he was 90% confident that the ceremony would be successful. The only problem was if an ordinary passageway could be constructed using ordinary materials that contained spirituality, or did it need to be Beyonder materials as well as a sufficient number of them. "I'll let Miss Justice and Mr. Hanged Man bear the cost of this experiment." In any case, they knew from the very beginning that the Tarot Club was a product of an attempt. It can be foreseen that there would be other attempts subsequently, and failure is inevitable. Even deities are no exception. Klein decided to transfer the costs. As the hanged man, Justice, and the sun were attempting to memorize the symbol, Klein chuckled. "If you forget, you can pray to me, and then you can remember." "All right," Audrey answered happily. With Mr. Fool, rituals aren't tedious and troublesome. She thought happily. The hanged man nodded in response as Klein continued the description. "Secondly, follow the normal procedure, but there's no need to burn any more additional herbs or apply the holy oil. There's no restriction on time, just chanting my name is enough. Remember, use ancient Hermes or Jotun to recite this piece of prayer. Your devoted servant prays for your attention, I pray for you to take his offerings. I pray for you to open the gates to your kingdom. After you finish chanting, combine the materials that contain spirituality with the natural power created by the incantation, and await my response. If you don't succeed in this step, change from materials containing spirituality to beyonder materials, and try again from the beginning. After listening quietly to the procedure, Alger felt that his previous guess was very likely to be the truth. The fool was in a predicament. He offered alluring attempts, making attempts one step at a time, and planned to use himself, Justice, and the sun to slowly break free of the restrictions. In the end, he might even descend into the real world. This was also the true reason why he had initially pulled people into this mysterious space, agreeing to the establishment of the Tarot Club. Even without this previous speculation, Alger believed that he would have come to the same conclusion after hearing of the experimental procedures required after the sacrificial ritual and comparing it with the fool's previous attempts. The only thing that stumped him was the possession of a powerful adorer, therefore, there was no need for him to use himself, Justice, and the sun. His adorer could make similar attempts. There must be secrets I don't know about yet. The attempts need to be sufficiently secretive. And perhaps his adorer is being watched by certain existences. Alger began connecting the dots. After Klein finished describing the ritual, he asked in a low but gentle voice, the sacrificial ritual needs a specific time. Mr. Hanged Man, when do you plan on making the attempt? This was different from responding to a request which could have a delayed response. The stable passage created by the sacrificial ritual could only exist for a very short period of time, so Klein had to wait above the gray fog ahead of time. The rainbow salamander's pituitary gland is the only beyonder material I have with me for the time being. As for materials with spirituality, I do have quite a lot. Mr. Fool, once the gathering ends, I'll immediately attempt the first scenario. If it fails, I'll seek out other beyonder materials. Once I obtain anything, I'll inform you by praying to confirm a time, Alger said as he couldn't help but turn his gaze towards Miss Justice. As a spectator, Audrey instantly understood what he meant. She answered without the slightest hesitation, if any additional beyonder materials are required, I'll compensate you afterward. Well, I can't guarantee the specific type of material you would want. As expected of the wealthy Miss Justice. The fool, Klein, couldn't help but sigh before chuckling. We have come to an agreement. He looked at Justice and said after some thought, once Mr. Hanged Man's attempt succeeds, I'll inform you of the bestowment ceremony. All right. Audrey was entirely confident with Mr. Fool's abilities. After answering the question, a sudden thought struck her as she realized that the exchange of money could also be done through this method. Of course, this was only if the attempt was a success. I wonder if items without any spirituality would work or not. I'll ask Mr. Fool again after the attempt is successful. Audrey's lips curled as she thought of the beautiful future. With the sacrifice and bestowment topic coming to an end, she deliberated for a few seconds before saying, Mr. Fool, I've found 2 ladies suitable for our tarot club. They're both beyonders and have their own circle and resources in Backland. They're also able to keep a secret and have decent personalities. Are you willing to let them join the gathering? Does Justice want to strengthen her faction within the tarot club? This was the most instinctual thought that Alger had. Derek was very interested in this matter as he looked sideways at Mr. Fool, waiting for his answer in anticipation. Klein appeared to be in a bit of a dilemma. Previously, he had imagined that the members of the Tarot Club wouldn't know each other, and they would then develop their own subordinates, forming a relatively tight and secretive organization. This way, even if a certain member was exposed, captured, or had their spirit channeled, it wouldn't have much of an impact on the Tarot Club. But Miss Justice's description just happened to hit his weak spot. He was hoping to find clues regarding the secret order and Lenivus by acquainting himself with beyonders with different circles and resources in Backland. If it's done through justice, the person involved would eventually hold back. However, I'm not sure if it's possible to pull them up above the gray fog simply by reciting my name. In order to maintain his image, Klein didn't think too much and instead procrastinated on it. He said calmly, "It will require a certain amount of examination. Miss Justice, use a clandestine method that wouldn't expose yourself to let them know of my name to garner interest in them." When Audrey saw that her proposal was about to be accepted, she immediately responded in excitement, "Yes, Mr. Fool." After a few more exchanges, the gathering came to an end. The sun, the hanged man, and Justice returned, while Klein remained in the gray fog, waiting for the sacrifice.